Hey guys, welcome to Gaijin Anime, and today I'll be talking about the top 10 underrated fantasy anime. We all know there is quite a lot of them in the fantasy niche. Well, some of them are less known than others, and I've compiled a list of 10 anime which I think are really great and perhaps not quite as widely known as they should be. Of course, this is all my personal preference, so if you have your own favorites, just let's dive into it. Number 10, Sacred Blacksmith. This is not very well known, but pretty decent 12 episode anime by Studio Manglobe. It's not necessarily a milestone, but it has very nice quality art and pretty good animation, some decent action and some fairly cute characters. And well, it's pretty heavy on the fan service. It's nothing super spectacular, but it's still quite an enjoyable anime to watch, if a little bit short with only 12 episodes. Number 9 is a classic, Tenkuu no Escaflowne or Vision of Escaflowne. This is a really old anime by today's standards and is from the ancient year of 1996, same year as Neon Genesis Evangelion, which kinda overshadowed it, since they're both in the giant mecha genre. But nevertheless, Escaflowne is a really good anime, and it has some really funny character designs. Note the noses. Perhaps it's one of the more remarkable steampunk mecha style anime. It has some pretty nice characters, including, Isaac Newton. Really good soundtrack by the really capable Kanno Yoko. Number 8, Maggie. This title is a more magic oriented one than the previous two. It takes place in a really classic Persian mythology style world with some absolutely classical characters such as Aladdin or Alibaba. Perhaps it is slightly more oriented to a female audience because, well, let's be honest, it's full of bishonen, so guys may not quite appreciate that, but yeah, it's still good looking and quite watchable. It has a rather complex and sometimes not very logical story, which takes place over 2 seasons. Overall, it's a quite colorful and intense anime, which, however, sometimes also gets pretty dark. It's an interesting watch if you like really magical, colorful fantasy full of bishonen. Number 7, Pandora Hearts. This is a really obscure title which not so many people have heard about. It's a relatively dark anime, perhaps in part inspired by Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. It has a rather complicated story with lots of twists, turns and surprises. The main heroine is also kind of special. I won't say any more than that. It's kind of difficult to summarize. Probably you should just check it out for yourself. I think it's a good watch, 26 episodes, and yeah, check it out. Number 6, Nanatsu no Taizai, or The Seven Sins. This anime is also kind of hard to place into a specific box. It features a biblical 7 sins as a generic plot device, which we already know, for example, from Full Metal Alchemist, but is otherwise a really rather loose take on the classical Christian values and stories. The 7 sins here are all people and are all kind of oddballs, not to mention that most of the time the whole company travels on the back of a giant pig. Overall, this is a rather lighthearted and fun fantasy anime with lots of humor and lots of fan service. Great opening and ending themes as well. Number 5, Isekai no Seikishi Monogatari, or Sacred Knights from Another World. It's a pretty straightforward but pretty nice harem fantasy anime. It's a spin-off from the really classic and kind of old, by today's standards, Tenshi Muyo by Kajishima Masaki. The series features the same style of semi-magic, semi-high-tech giant mecha. The same style as in Tenchi Photon, Tenshi Muyo Galaxy Police, or various other anime in this universe, because it's kind of a big universe. The hero is Masaki Kenshi, who is Tenchi's younger half-brother. It's a harem. Lots of girls. One unusual fact about this anime is that, different from the typical format of 23 minutes to 25 minutes, here you have episodes which last almost 50 minutes. So it's kind of strange, it's almost OVA style. It's an unusual format, but it's kind of immersive. So when you start to watch it, you basically just can't quit. Quite a recommendation. Number 4, Utawarerumono. That's another difficult to pronounce title, which literally it means those who are sung. Don't ask me. This anime is an adaptation of an adult visual novel. Well, basically it follows the story of a classic hero who has lost his memory, awakens in an unfamiliar fantasy world, and just gradually goes along meeting people, killing people and stuff. The development of the story is kind of surprising, and the conclusion is really grand and encompasses a lot. It's an interesting story. In its setting, it's a harem, so you have the main guy and you have quite a few girls. It's somewhat unusual because the protagonist is not the typical superhero or the typical idiot, which you commonly see in harem series. In this case, he's kind of logical and kind of a strategist. So it's kind of different from the typical superhero cliche or the loser cliche where the guy just can't do anything and all the women just jump at him for no reason at all. In this case, it all makes sense, so it's a pretty nice story. It has a much newer sequel called Utawarerumono no Kame, which, however, I didn't like that much, to be honest. So, kind of, perhaps the hero was a letdown there, because the original hero in Utawarerumono was a really good one, and Utawarerumono no Kame, not so great. But yeah, the original one, watch it. Number 3, Tower of Druaga, or Druaga no To. This is a 2-season classic fantasy. If you play RPG games, or especially Japanese RPG games, then you really like it, because it's so much RPG-like that it's basically like an SAO before SAO. You have the typical party setup with tank, healer, mage, range damage, whatever, the goblins, treasure, the levels, and whatever. The fun thing is it's kind of a comedy setup, so there is lots of random fun in it and kind of amusing relationships between the characters and some fairly interesting character development, especially in the second season. Probably you should watch the 2 seasons back to back, because the conclusion of the first one is kind of a cliffhanger. With both seasons watched together, I think it's a great immersive world and absolute recommendation in the fantasy genre. Number 2, Scrapp Princess, or Scrapp Princess, or Stepri, if you really shorten it. This is another interesting example of a fantasy anime with a really deep and interesting story. It starts kind of run-of-the-mill fantasy with bows and magic and whatever, but as it goes on, it gets really complex and kind of even becomes sci-fi instead of fantasy. So it's a really interesting, metamorphosis. You don't usually see this in anime or in real movies or wherever. The end is really philosophical, kind of strong conclusion, very powerful conclusion here. From the art or animation standpoint, this is not a modern anime by any means, so even the aspect ratio is the old 4:3 one, so there is not much to write home about here. But I think if you're a fan of fantasy, of nice characters, of really professional seiyuu work, there are some star seiyuu in this series, I think this makes up for it. Totally definite recommendation from me. Number 1, Koukaku no Regios, or Chrome-Shelled Regios. This is a really unique title. It's not really all that well known. It's a great fantasy anime in various ways. It is a light novel adaptation and has been a personal favorite of mine for a long time. The setting is a post-apocalyptic world with a few living city-states moving around the surface of this planet. And there is some giant monsters which kind of endanger everybody. One other thing that's kind of unique about it is the interesting battle mechanics, where the Dragon Ball inspired ki energy is combined with high-tech devices that channel and amplify it. It's kind of an interesting idea. I mean, there's a few other anime which have done this, but probably Regios was one of the first. One of the great points about the series is some of the characters, especially the hero. The hero in the series is very unusual. You don't really see that often nowadays, because today the heroes are typically either some absolute losers or some totally overpowered heroes. In this case, it's more realistic. The guy is really powerful and very skilled, but he's kind of understated. He doesn't brag too much. He doesn't carry himself like I'm the boss here. He's just cool, goes around his business. When stuff needs to be done, he gets it done. I like this hero. From the semi-harem around him, there are also quite a few nice characters in my opinion. You can basically take your pick there. Yet another plus is the quite fantastic soundtrack by Asakura Daisuke, which is kind of, techno, but perhaps electronic techno or something like that, kind of unusual style. Regrettably, the light novel author has already passed away, so the story has remained a little bit inconclusive. That's probably the one major downside to this anime. Nevertheless, I still hold the series in very high regard, and I highly recommend it to anyone interested in the fantasy genre. Okay, so this wraps up the top 10 underrated fantasy anime, my version. If you think I've forgotten some good series, or if you have your own recommendations, feel free to write them in the comments below. As usual, thanks for watching. See you next time. Matane.